Dylan Carter stood at the edge of the party, the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses reverberating around the luxurious estate. His guests, dressed in their finest, circled around the garden, admiring the view. Meanwhile, Miguel Ortega, the gardener, worked tirelessly under the hot sun, trimming hedges and keeping the grounds immaculate. Dylan watched him from a distance, sipping his drink, his gaze lingering with an air of superiority. Miguel's sweat-soaked shirt clung to his muscular frame, a stark contrast to the polished guests around him. As the evening wore on, Dylan's boredom grew. Looking for a way to entertain himself, he casually tossed a challenge toward the gardener, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Lift this weight and I'll give you my luxury car." The statement hung in the air, punctuated by the sound of laughter from the other guests. It was meant to be a joke, an insult disguised as a game. After all, who would believe that a man like Miguel, whose job was to tend gardens, could possibly lift something that heavy? The barbell was an enormous piece of equipment, clearly designed for those with strength far beyond the average person. Dylan smirked as he gestured toward it, his words cutting through the chatter. "Go ahead, give it a try, impress us all." The crowd laughed again, the entire situation a spectacle to them. It was a moment of power for Dylan, a chance to belittle someone he considered beneath him. The others watched with anticipation, eager to see the inevitable failure. But Miguel didn't respond with laughter or anger. He didn't even acknowledge the mocking tone in Dylan's voice. He simply stared at the barbell, his brow furrowed in deep thought. There was no hesitation, no sign of doubt in his eyes. His gaze shifted from the weight to Dylan, holding a quiet intensity that none of the onlookers could decipher. For a moment, everything seemed to stand still, except for the weight of the challenge that had just been laid before him. Dylan's smirk faltered slightly as he noticed the silent determination in Miguel's eyes. The gardener didn't move or speak, yet there was something about him that felt different. The usual reactions he expected, nervous laughter, a quick refusal, or even anger, didn't come. Instead, there was a calmness in Miguel's demeanor that seemed to unsettle him. It was as though the challenge wasn't even worthy of a response. Dylan tried to shrug off the discomfort, but it lingered in the back of his mind. The guests were growing restless, waiting for something to happen. Dylan was beginning to feel the weight of their gaze, the expectation hanging thick in the air. He shifted his feet and cleared his throat, but Miguel still remained unmoved. It wasn't defiance, it was something deeper, something beyond the surface. Dylan had seen men like Miguel before, hard workers, quiet men who didn't speak much. But there was something in his presence now that felt different, something almost intimidating. Finally, Miguel began to walk toward the barbell, his footsteps slow and deliberate. There was no hurry in his movement, no rush to prove himself. The crowd fell silent, watching him with bated breath. As he reached the barbell, he bent down, gripping it with both hands. The moment felt surreal, like time had slowed, the air thick with tension. Dylan's eyes narrowed as he watched Miguel, not knowing what to expect next. The gardener's focus never wavered. He was fully immersed in the task at hand. Miguel's muscles tensed as he prepared to lift the massive weight. His face remained calm, but there was a sense of quiet power emanating from him that made everyone watch even more intently. Dylan's mocking smile returned, but it faltered the moment Miguel began to lift. The weight seemed to rise effortlessly, and for a brief moment, Dylan wondered if he had underestimated this man. But the gardener's calm resolve never wavered, and Dylan realized that something was about to happen that would change everything. The party carried on with laughter and chatter, but Dylan was now consumed with the idea of testing Miguel. He couldn't let it go, the way the gardener had lifted the weight with such ease, without a single word, without hesitation. It wasn't just that Miguel had managed to lift it, it was the calm, almost unsettling way he did it. Dylan felt a need to prove to himself and everyone around him that this man was nothing more than a simple laborer, no different from the rest. His pride couldn't let go of the challenge. He picked up the barbell again, holding it up to Miguel. "All right, let's see if you can do it again, big guy," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He gestured dismissively toward the weight, his eyes challenging Miguel. The guests, still watching, exchanged glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief. They had no doubt that Miguel couldn't repeat what he had done. The tension in the air grew thicker as all eyes focused on the gardener, who remained silent, almost unreadable. Miguel's body language hadn't changed much. His posture remained relaxed, his expression unreadable. He didn't react to Dylan's taunts or the crowd's growing anticipation. Everyone had expected him to shrink back or become defensive. But instead, he stood there, calm and unbothered, as if the challenge meant nothing. The eyes of the onlookers were now fixed on him, waiting for a response. But there was something about his silence that made them uneasy. He wasn't playing their game. The moment stretched longer than anyone expected. Dylan's grin faded, but he didn't back down. He wanted to see Miguel fail, wanted to see that smug silence shattered. But Miguel simply looked at the weight for a long moment, the only indication of his thoughts being the slight tightening of his jaw. He glanced at the crowd, then back at the barbell, and for a split second, the air seemed to stand still. There was an almost imperceptible shift in his demeanor, a quiet resolve settling in his eyes. Suddenly, he took a step forward, his muscles subtly flexing as he bent down to grip the barbell. His movements were deliberate and calculated, slow but purposeful. The crowd held its collective breath, waiting for him to make the first move. But there was something more in his gaze now, an intensity that hadn't been there before. He wasn't just going through the motions. It was as though the weight itself had become a reflection of something deeper, something that could not be ignored. As his hands wrapped around the barbell, there was a flash in Miguel's mind, a brief moment where his past resurfaced. He remembered the early days, the grueling hours spent lifting weights in a dark gym, a place that had once been his sanctuary. The intensity of the training, the relentless push to achieve something greater than himself, it had all led him to this point. But why had he kept his strength a secret? Why hadn't he ever used it for something more than the mundane tasks of his everyday life? The gym he once trained in had been far from a luxury facility. It had been gritty, raw, and unpolished, a reflection of his own journey. Back then, he was driven by the need to escape his past, to prove to himself that he could be more than just another faceless worker. But somewhere along the way, his goals shifted. He didn't want to show off or seek validation anymore. The quiet satisfaction of knowing his own strength had been enough. But here, now in this moment, that old desire to prove himself resurfaced, even if only for a fleeting second. As he began to lift the barbell, a wave of focus washed over him, and all thoughts of the past melted away. It was just him and the weight, and for the first time in a long time, he felt truly alive. Miguel's body moved with precision and strength, his muscles flexing in a fluid motion as the barbell slowly rose from the ground. His focus was absolute, and the room seemed to hold its breath as they witnessed something extraordinary. Dylan, who had expected another failure, couldn't hide the shock in his eyes. Miguel was not what he appeared to be, and Dylan had no idea just how far this challenge would go. Miguel's fingers wrapped firmly around the cold metal barbell. His posture was still calm, but there was a quiet intensity in the way he positioned his feet, like a deep well of power waiting to be released. He shifted his weight slightly, adjusting himself before pulling with all the force he could muster. The strain was evident, but his movements were methodical, controlled. The barbell creaked as it began to lift, a sound that filled the otherwise quiet space. The crowd's murmur quieted, and all eyes turned to Miguel, who was defying their expectations. At first it seemed impossible. The weight looked like it might never budge, as if it were cemented to the ground. Dylan's smirk remained for a moment, but it began to falter as the barbell rose slightly off the floor. The guests watched, their chatter dying out, replaced by a tense silence. Miguel's arms trembled slightly, but his focus never wavered. With each inch the barbell lifted, The weight of the challenge seemed to shift from impossible to inevitable. The onlookers held their breath as the gardener continued with a quiet determination. Dylan's disbelief grew as Miguel lifted the weight higher. The laughter that had once echoed through the garden now seemed like a distant memory, replaced by a nervous anticipation. Miguel, a simple gardener, was doing something that Dylan never imagined possible. His muscles flexed, straining with effort, but there was no panic, no rush, just quiet precision. As the barbell rose inch by inch, Dylan's mouth went dry. The murmurs of surprise started to grow, and even the most skeptical of the guests began to shift uneasily. The moment stretched, and the impossible seemed to become reality. Miguel's face remained calm, even as he struggled to maintain his grip. His hands were coated in sweat, his breath quickening, but there was an undeniable confidence in his posture. The barbell moved steadily upward, past the point where Dylan had expected it to drop. The guests were paralyzed by the spectacle, their eyes wide, unable to tear themselves away. For a fleeting moment, the entire event seemed to revolve around that single act of strength, and no one knew how to respond. With one final heave, Miguel brought the barbell fully upright. The crowd erupted in a mixture of gasps and reluctant applause, but Miguel didn't acknowledge them. His face remained unchanged, stoic and unreadable. He gently set the weight back down with a quiet clink, the sound almost too sharp in the tense air. The heavy silence was broken only by the faint hum of the evening breeze. Miguel straightened up and turned away, as if the entire challenge had meant little to him. He resumed his work in the garden, unaffected by the commotion he had just caused. Dylan stood frozen, his hand still hovering where he had originally placed it on the weight. His usual confidence had evaporated, replaced by a growing sense of confusion and awe. His mouth opened slightly as he tried to form words, but nothing came. It was as if his entire perception of Miguel had been shattered in that one quiet moment. The gardener, a man he had assumed was just another laborer, had just done something beyond belief. Dylan didn't know how to process what he had just witnessed. Miguel's lack of reaction only heightened the mystery. Most people would have sought acknowledgement, perhaps a proud smile or a comment on their strength. But Miguel had simply returned to his work, acting as if lifting a weight far beyond what anyone could manage was just another task to him. Dylan's mind raced as he watched the gardener walk away. There was something about him that felt completely out of place in this world of luxury and ease. Who was this man, really? What other surprises lay hidden beneath his quiet exterior? Dylan couldn't shake the image of Miguel walking away, his back straight, his stride purposeful. It was as though the gardener had accomplished something far more significant than merely lifting a barbell. Dylan's mind churned with questions. How had Miguel hidden this power for so long? And why had he never revealed it before? Dylan's pride and arrogance fought against the nagging suspicion that he might have just underestimated the gardener in a way he couldn't yet understand. As the evening wore on, Dylan could think of nothing else but the mystery that was Miguel Ortega. Dylan couldn't let the incident go. His mind simmered with frustration, replaying the moment over and over in his head. Miguel had completely thrown him off guard, and Dylan hated that feeling. The laughter of the guests still echoed in his ears, and the way Miguel had calmly lifted the barbell haunted him. He couldn't stand being outdone, especially by someone he had dismissed as just another worker. Dylan's pride was bruised, and he was determined to get back at Miguel to put him in his place. The next opportunity to challenge him would be different. At the next event, Dylan made sure to approach Miguel with a purpose. He had to regain control, to remind everyone of who was really in charge. With a smirk on his face, he casually walked up to the gardener, who was again tending to the plants, and tossed a comment his way. "You did pretty well last time," Dylan said, trying to sound nonchalant, though there was an edge to his voice. "How about you lift this weight again and I'll give you my luxury car? Not that you deserve it, of course, but it's a pretty good offer." Miguel paused for a moment, his hands still moving through the soil as if the offer meant nothing. Dylan waited for the familiar reaction, disbelief, hesitation, perhaps even excitement. But Miguel simply straightened up and turned to face him. The offer hung in the air, but Miguel showed no interest. His gaze met Dylan's, but there was no challenge in his eyes, no desire to engage with the millionaire's taunts. "No thanks," Miguel said quietly, his voice calm and even. He didn't flinch. "I don't need your car." And just like that, he turned back to his work. Dylan was stunned by the indifference. He had expected something more, maybe a hint of desperation or a show of humility. But instead, Miguel had dismissed him effortlessly, without a second thought. The crowd, who had been watching intently, murmured in confusion. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. Dylan's offer was supposed to be a trap, an opportunity to show his superiority. Yet here was Miguel, acting as if the luxury car didn't matter at all. Dylan couldn't understand it. He had expected this to be a game, but Miguel had played by his own rules, and that Dylan couldn't handle. Dylan's frustration only grew. He had offered a luxury car, something that most people would jump at, and Miguel had refused without hesitation. It didn't make sense. Dylan had to know why. Who was this man who didn't care about material wealth, who didn't seek validation from the things that Dylan took for granted? Miguel was just a gardener, a worker. He didn't belong in the same league. And yet, he had shown Dylan up in a way that felt more profound than a mere physical display. The more Dylan thought about it, the more unsettled he became. Determined to figure out more about Miguel, Dylan began to dig into his background. He started with simple inquiries, asking around to learn more about the man who had challenged him so unexpectedly. He spoke to people at the event, some who worked with Miguel, others who had seen him around, but every answer he received seemed to raise more questions. No one knew much about him. Miguel didn't have a social media presence, no record of achievements or accolades. He had always been a shadow, a quiet presence who did his job without drawing attention to himself. The more Dylan dug, the more elusive Miguel became. There were no rumors, no stories of past glory or hidden talents. All he could uncover was that Miguel had been working as a gardener for as long as anyone could remember. There were no signs of the kind of training that could explain his strength, no indication that he had ever been anything but the hard-working man he appeared to be. Dylan found himself frustrated, and the mystery only deepened. Miguel was an enigma, someone who seemed so ordinary on the surface, yet had just proved himself in a way that no one could deny. Dylan's obsession with Miguel's past began to take over his thoughts. He couldn't let go of the idea that there was something more to this gardener than met the eye. The questions gnawed at him, and the more he tried to uncover, the less he seemed to understand. Miguel had no history, no recognizable identity, and yet he had managed to make Dylan feel powerless. Dylan was no stranger to power or influence, but with Miguel, he was left with a deep sense of uncertainty. Who was he really? And what was he hiding? Miguel returned to his modest home in the suburbs later that evening, his hands still rough from the day's work. The soft glow of the kitchen lights spilled through the window, casting a warm, welcoming glow over the small house. Isabel, his wife, was sitting at the dining table, their two young children playing in the corner. She smiled at the sight of him, but there was something in his demeanor that caught her attention. Miguel's usual warmth seemed distant, replaced by a quiet intensity. She felt a shift, a subtle change that she couldn't quite place. "Miguel," Isabel said gently, as she watched him take off his boots by the door. "You okay? You've been different since today." Her voice was filled with concern, but also with a hint of curiosity. She noticed that he hadn't said much about the challenge earlier, nor had he mentioned anything about the people from the event. It was as though he had closed off part of himself. She had never seen him like this, and though she trusted him, the distance was unsettling. Miguel didn't answer right away. He moved through the house as if in a trance, putting his tools away and preparing dinner. The usual rhythm of his evening felt out of sync, as though his mind was elsewhere. Isabel watched him quietly, sensing the undercurrent of tension in the air. It wasn't like him to remain so silent. In the past, he'd been open with her about his thoughts, his worries, but now he seemed more focused, as if something greater was driving him. She couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. "I'm fine," Miguel finally replied, his voice low and calm, but there was an edge to it that Isabel hadn't heard before. He gave her a reassuring smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Isabel studied him for a moment, trying to decipher the change in him. There was something in his posture, something in the way he moved, that felt different. It was as if he was preparing for something he wasn't sharing. She knew him too well to let it slide, but she decided not to press him further for now. That night, after dinner, Miguel excused himself early. Isabel, after tucking the kids into bed, found him in the small backyard, standing by the old shed where he kept his tools. She watched from the window as he began to train, his movements sharp and purposeful. Miguel was lifting weights, pushing his body through exercises he had done countless times before, but tonight there was a new intensity in his actions. His muscles strained as he pushed past his limits, sweat dripping down his forehead, his focus unwavering. There was something different in the way he moved, a sense of urgency. Isabel couldn't tear her eyes away from the window, her curiosity growing. She had seen him train before, of course. Miguel was always focused on keeping in shape for his work, but this was different. The weight of each lift seemed more deliberate, as if he was preparing for something far beyond a simple physical task. She knew Miguel was strong, but the strength he was showing tonight went beyond what she had seen in the past. She wondered why he felt the need to push himself so hard, so late at night when no one was watching. Miguel finished his training after a few hours, his body covered in sweat and exhaustion. He didn't seem to notice Isabel standing there, watching from the window. It was as if he was lost in his own world, focused on something only he could understand. He didn't speak a word, just silently wiped his face with a towel and went back inside. Isabel remained at the window for a long time after he had gone, deep in thought. She had seen this side of him before, the quiet determination, the drive to push beyond his limits, but something told her that this time was different. Miguel had always been a man of few words, someone who kept his thoughts to himself. But tonight, Isabel had seen a glimpse of something far more intense than she had ever known about him. He was preparing for something bigger than just a physical challenge or an event. She didn't know what it was, but she sensed that Miguel was hiding something from her. She respected his need for privacy, but she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was motivating him, it was far more than just a personal goal. Miguel was preparing for something that would change everything. Dylan could not shake the feeling that something about Miguel was off. The gardener's casual display of strength had left him uneasy, and he found himself unable to stop thinking about it. It wasn't just the fact that Miguel had lifted the barbell with ease, it was the way he had done it, so effortlessly, like it was nothing. Dylan's mind kept returning to the moment, replaying it over and over. He had to know how Miguel had acquired such strength. There had to be an explanation, something more than just hard work in the garden. Unable to let the matter rest, Dylan began to ask around. His first stop was an old acquaintance of Miguel's, a former gym owner who had worked with the gardener in the past. Dylan hoped to uncover some hidden piece of information that would explain the mystery behind Miguel's strength. But when he spoke to the man, the answers he received were vague at best. "Miguel? Yeah, he used to come by the gym back in the day," the gym owner said. "He was strong, but he never competed or anything, just worked out on his own." It didn't make sense. If Miguel was just another gym goer, why had he been so incredibly strong? The more Dylan tried to dig into Miguel's past, the more elusive the answers became. Every lead he followed seemed to lead nowhere. The gym owner had little to add, and others who had known Miguel over the years were just as vague. They all described him as a hard-working man, someone who kept to himself and avoided attention. But there was always that nagging question. If Miguel was just a simple gardener, how could he have the strength to lift a weight that even professional athletes struggled with? Dylan felt like he was missing something, a key piece of the puzzle that was just out of reach. Despite his frustration, Dylan couldn't stop his search. His obsession with Miguel grew, as did his discomfort. The more he uncovered, the more questions arose. He learned that Miguel had once worked in an elite gym, training alongside some of the best athletes, but there was no record of him ever competing or making any attempt to show off his abilities. It didn't add up. Miguel had trained with the best, yet he had never pursued the fame or accolades that usually came with such strength. Why had he kept it all hidden? And why had he never told anyone about it? Dylan's curiosity deepened, but so did his unease. The more he learned, the more he realized he didn't know. The man he had thought was just a gardener was turning out to be someone far more complex. Miguel's past, the hidden layers of his life, were starting to unravel, but the truth remained out of reach. Dylan couldn't help but wonder what else Miguel had kept hidden, and why. There had to be a reason for the secrecy, for the quiet strength that Miguel possessed. It was becoming clear that Miguel was not just a simple laborer, and the more Dylan uncovered, the more his perception of the man was shattered. The deeper Dylan went into his investigation, the more uncomfortable he became. He had spent years building his own empire, relying on power, influence, and wealth to get what he wanted. But Miguel's quiet strength, his ability to remain invisible while hiding something so extraordinary, began to disturb him. Dylan had always thought of himself as someone who understood people, who could read them easily. But with Miguel, he had been completely wrong. It felt like Miguel was playing a different game altogether, and Dylan didn't know the rules. As Dylan sat alone in his office late that night, sifting through the information he had gathered, a sense of unease settled over him. He couldn't explain why, but he had the distinct feeling that something was coming. It was as though the investigation had revealed only the surface, and beneath it lay a deeper, darker truth. Dylan could sense that he was on the brink of something much larger than a simple challenge or physical feat. Miguel was no ordinary man, and whatever secrets he was hiding, Dylan was getting closer to uncovering them. But would he be ready for what he discovered? The mystery surrounding Miguel had consumed him, and now Dylan could feel a shift within himself. He was no longer just chasing answers. He was chasing something more elusive, something more dangerous. With every step, the questions grew harder, the stakes higher. Dylan had always prided himself on being in control, but now it felt as though the control was slipping from his grasp. And as the pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place, Dylan realized that the truth he was about to uncover might be more than he could handle. The next event was held at one of Dylan's luxurious properties. It was grand, extravagant, everything Dylan loved. Yet there was something different about this night. Miguel was there again, working quietly in the background, keeping to himself as always. But this time, Dylan couldn't shake the feeling that the two of them were destined to cross paths once more. It wasn't just about strength anymore. There was something deeper, something that had been building in Dylan since their last encounter. He was no longer satisfied with just proving his dominance physically. He needed to break Miguel mentally. Dylan approached Miguel with a cold smile, determined to provoke him once more. "You didn't take me up on the car last time, so let's make it more interesting," he said, his voice steady, yet laced with a challenge. "How about a real test this time? Not just some weightlifting stunt, but a competition of true strength. We'll see who really has power." He looked Miguel square in the eye, waiting for a reaction. The room was filled with anticipation, everyone eager to witness another showdown. But Miguel didn't flinch. His eyes remained calm, his posture still. Miguel stepped forward slowly, his gaze unwavering. "Strength isn't just physical," he said, his voice low but confident. The words were cryptic, almost as if he was speaking to someone beyond Dylan, beyond the crowd. True strength comes from within. It's not about what you can lift or how hard you push your body. It's about knowing your limits and having the wisdom to control them. Dylan frowned, unsure of where Miguel was going with this. He had expected another simple show of physical power, but instead, he was being met with something far more profound, something he hadn't anticipated. Wisdom, Dylan repeated, a hint of skepticism in his voice. You talk like you're some kind of philosopher, Miguel. This isn't about wisdom. It's about power. Real power. Something you clearly don't have. The crowd hushed, eager for Miguel's response. But Miguel didn't react to the insult. Instead, he stepped closer to Dylan, his presence now commanding the space between them. Real power, Miguel said, almost as if speaking directly to Dylan's soul, is not about showing off what you can do. It's about knowing what you don't need to prove. The words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. Dylan stood frozen for a moment, unsure of how to respond. Miguel had just turned the conversation on its head, challenging Dylan's very understanding of power. It was as if Miguel was saying that all the wealth, all the status Dylan had worked so hard for meant nothing if it wasn't backed by something deeper, something more intangible. Dylan had always thought of himself as powerful, wealthy, influential, and in control of his world. But now, in the face of Miguel's quiet certainty, doubt began to creep into his mind. Miguel continued, his voice calm and steady, but with an undeniable authority. Humility is strength, Dylan. The greatest strength lies in knowing when to stand back, when to let go of the need for dominance. Confidence doesn't come from having more than others. It comes from being content with who you are, no matter what anyone else has. The words hit Dylan harder than he cared to admit. His mind raced as he tried to process them. Could it be true? Was everything he had worked for, his wealth, his status, his power, actually a fragile illusion built on insecurity? Dylan felt his grip on the situation slipping. He had always believed that power was about control, about being the one in charge, about conquering everyone around him. But now, Miguel was making him question everything. Could strength really come from within? From knowing yourself and being comfortable with your own limits? Could humility and confidence, not wealth and physical power, be the true markers of strength? The seed of doubt had been planted, and Dylan felt the discomfort grow within him. He didn't know how to respond, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of vulnerability. The tension between them grew as the crowd watched in silence. Dylan's mind swirled with conflicting thoughts. How could this simple gardener, this man who seemed so ordinary, have the ability to unravel everything Dylan had built for himself? It was as if Miguel had exposed the cracks in Dylan's armor, revealing his inner fears and insecurities. Dylan had always thought he understood strength, but now he wasn't so sure. For the first time, the words Miguel had spoken felt like a challenge to everything Dylan believed about power, and that uncertainty shook him more than anything else. That evening, as the night settled around their small home, Miguel found himself alone with Isabel in their dimly lit living room. The weight of the day's events, the challenge, the growing tension with Dylan, and the haunting realization of his own purpose had been too much to carry alone. Isabel, always perceptive, noticed something was off. She sat beside him, her gentle eyes filled with concern. "Miguel, you've been so distant. What's going on? What's happening to you?" Miguel looked at her, a mixture of resolve and vulnerability in his eyes, knowing it was time to reveal the truth. He took a deep breath, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's something I haven't told you, something I've kept hidden for years." Isabel's heart skipped a beat as she leaned closer, waiting for him to continue. Miguel hesitated for a moment, as if weighing the decision. "I wasn't always just a gardener. Before this life, I had a mentor, someone who taught me not just how to be strong physically, but how to control my mind, my emotions. They showed me how power isn't just about muscles, it's about discipline, about mental strength." Isabel's mind raced as she tried to process what he was saying. Miguel paused, his gaze distant, as if he was reliving something from the past. This mentor, they weren't just anyone. They were someone who understood true strength, someone who believed in the mind's ability to shape reality. "They taught me to hold back, to blend in, to never reveal the extent of my abilities." Isabel's eyes widened. She had always known that Miguel was different, but hearing the truth now was something she hadn't been prepared for. The man she married, the man she thought she understood, was a mystery, and that mystery was deeper than she could have imagined. But why? Isabel asked, her voice tinged with confusion. Why hide all of this? Why not use it, Miguel? Miguel's eyes darkened, as if the weight of his past was a burden he could never quite shake off. Because I didn't want recognition, Isabel. I didn't want to be known for my strength. I wanted to live quietly, to be with you and the kids without the distractions of fame or power. But now it feels like it's time. I've been holding back for too long. His voice grew softer, but there was a fire in his words that Isabel hadn't seen before. Miguel continued, his tone now resolute. I've trained for something bigger than what happened with Dylan. That challenge was just the beginning, but I'm preparing for something much more important, something that will force me to reveal my true potential. Isabel felt a chill run down her spine. She had always known that Miguel carried a quiet power, but the idea that he was preparing for something greater, something unknown, felt like stepping into uncharted waters. She didn't know if she should feel proud of his strength or frightened by the depth of the secret he had been hiding for so long. For the first time, Isabel wasn't sure what to say. A part of her wanted to encourage Miguel, to support him in whatever path he chose, but another part of her was filled with uncertainty. She loved Miguel, but this was more than just a decision about strength. This was about power, influence, and the world seeing him for who he truly was. Was he ready for the consequences of revealing everything? And if he wasn't, would it tear apart the life they had built together? Miguel's eyes met hers, his expression soft but determined. I've always been in control of my own destiny, Isabel. But now, the time has come for me to stop hiding. I can't live in the shadows anymore. Isabel sat back, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She had always admired Miguel's strength and humility, but now, with the truth laid bare before her, she wasn't sure if she was ready for what that meant. Was this the right choice for him? And if it wasn't, what would it cost them all? The silence between them grew, heavy with the weight of Miguel's revelation. Isabel couldn't help but feel a sense of fear. Fear not just for Miguel, but for the unknown future they were about to face. She had always supported him, stood by him, but this felt different. Miguel was stepping into a world that could either elevate them or destroy everything they had built. I don't know what to say, Miguel, she whispered, but I'll stand by you. I just hope we're ready for what's coming. Miguel reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. I hope so too. Dylan's obsession with Miguel had reached its peak. Every day, he found himself replaying the images of Miguel, lifting that impossible weight, and speaking cryptic words that had begun to shake his belief system. Dylan could no longer ignore the nagging feeling that Miguel was hiding something far greater than strength alone. His need to prove himself, to assert his dominance, had become all-consuming. At a high-profile gathering, Dylan finally confronted Miguel, the challenge in his eyes unmistakable. Let's make this official, he said. A competition, physical and mental endurance. You and me, let's see who's truly strong. Miguel looked at him, his expression unreadable. Dylan's challenge was clear. He wanted a battle not just of muscles, but of wills. Dylan was no longer content with a simple test of strength. He wanted to break Miguel mentally, to strip away the mystery and expose whatever hidden power Miguel had been keeping to himself. The guests around them buzzed with excitement, eager to witness the showdown. But Miguel, ever composed, simply nodded. There was no arrogance in his response, no desire to prove anything to Dylan. He was simply accepting what was coming, prepared for what lay ahead. As the competition approached, Miguel began his preparation in solitude, moving with a quiet intensity that was both methodical and focused. He didn't need to show off, and he certainly didn't need anyone's approval. What Dylan didn't know was that Miguel's true strength was not just in his muscles or his ability to push his body to its limits. It was in something deeper, something far more elusive, his mind. Miguel's mentor had taught him how to master his thoughts, how to remain calm in the face of any challenge, and how to use his mental clarity as a weapon. Every night, Miguel trained not just his body, but his mind. He meditated, visualized the upcoming competition, and centered his thoughts on the outcome he desired. He knew that physical strength alone wouldn't win this competition. Dylan might be strong, but he lacked the mental discipline that Miguel had spent years cultivating. Miguel had learned to control his emotions, his thoughts, to find stillness in the chaos. His preparation was unlike anything Dylan could fathom, and it was this skill that would ultimately decide the outcome of their final showdown. In the days leading up to the event, Dylan's confidence only grew. He trained relentlessly, focusing on pushing his body to its limits, lifting heavier weights, running longer distances, and ensuring that his endurance would surpass Miguel's. He believed that brute force, sheer determination, and a will to dominate would be enough to crush Miguel's quiet strength. But every time he looked at Miguel, standing silently in the corner, Dylan couldn't help but feel that there was more at play than just physical prowess. Miguel exuded an aura of calm, like a man who had already won, and that unnerved Dylan. On the day of the competition, the atmosphere was electric. Guests filled the venue, eager to witness the ultimate test of strength and will. Dylan stood tall, confident in his ability to defeat Miguel. He had everything on his side: wealth, status, physical ability. But as the competition began, Dylan couldn't ignore the unsettling feeling creeping over him. Miguel moved with a quiet grace, his focus unshakable. There was no rush, no desperation to win. It was as if he was already in control, and Dylan was beginning to realize that this wasn't a battle of muscles. It was a battle of minds. The first few rounds were intense, both men pushing their bodies to the brink. But as the challenge shifted to mental endurance, Dylan began to falter. Miguel's ability to stay composed, to remain unshaken by the pressure, became evident. While Dylan struggled to maintain his focus, Miguel seemed to thrive in the challenge. He spoke little, his concentration sharp, his mind clear. As the tests grew more complex, Dylan's frustration began to build. He was used to dominating every situation, but here, in this mental battleground, Miguel was his equal, and in some ways, his superior. With each passing moment, Dylan's confidence waned. He had underestimated Miguel, believing that sheer strength and power would win the day. But as the competition neared its climax, Dylan realized that Miguel's strength was not something he could overpower. It wasn't physical, but something far more potent. Miguel had the mental endurance to outlast him, the clarity of thought to control the situation. Dylan's mind raced as he fought to stay focused, but it was clear that Miguel had already won, not just the competition, but Dylan's respect. In that final moment, as the challenge ended, Dylan was left with one undeniable truth. Strength, true strength, came from within. The competition began in front of an eager crowd, the energy in the air electric with anticipation. Dylan, full of confidence, was ready to crush Miguel. He had trained for this moment for weeks, every move calculated, every muscle prepared for battle. As the first round kicked off, Dylan pushed himself to the limit, using every ounce of his strength to try and outdo Miguel. He lifted heavier weights, ran faster, and exerted himself beyond what he thought possible. But Miguel, with calm precision, matched every move, his focus unwavering, his movements deliberate. The physical challenge, though fierce, was only the beginning. Dylan could feel the sweat dripping down his back as he struggled to maintain his pace, each round more difficult than the last. His strategy was simple: outlast Miguel, break his will through sheer force. But Miguel never faltered. It was as if the gardener had tapped into a well of strength Dylan couldn't access. Every time Dylan tried to push harder, Miguel responded with equal, if not superior, effort. His eyes remained steady, his breathing controlled. It was clear to Dylan now that this wasn't just about physical power. It was about something much deeper, and that something Dylan couldn't seem to touch. The rounds progressed, and Dylan's frustration grew. He had assumed that his superior conditioning would give him the edge, but with each test, Miguel defied his expectations. In the mental challenges that followed the physical ones, Miguel continued to shine. While Dylan struggled to concentrate, his mind racing with pressure, Miguel remained calm, focused, and unfazed. He didn't react to the tricks Dylan tried to play on him, subtle psychological games designed to rattle his concentration. It was clear that Miguel's mind was as strong as his body, and that was the real game changer. Dylan's usual tricks were no match for Miguel's mental fortitude. Every attempt Dylan made to get inside Miguel's head fell flat. He tried to throw him off balance with taunts, with games of intimidation, but Miguel didn't flinch. Instead, he answered every challenge with a steady gaze and a quiet confidence that seemed to deepen the more Dylan pushed. Miguel's mastery over his own emotions and thoughts was evident. It was as though he had been preparing for this moment for his entire life, and Dylan, for all his resources and strength, was simply outmatched. With each round, Dylan's confidence waned, replaced by a growing sense of unease. The physical tasks were exhausting, but it was the mental tests where he truly felt the shift. Miguel's focus was unbreakable, and Dylan could feel his own mind slipping, unable to maintain the clarity he needed. He had always prided himself on his ability to control situations, but here, Miguel had the upper hand. Dylan was used to being in control, to being the one who dictated the terms, but in this competition, Miguel was the one who held the reins. Dylan's mind raced, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't catch up. The tension between them became palpable as the competition neared its final stages. Dylan had given everything he had, but it was clear that Miguel was in control. Each test, each challenge, was another reminder that Dylan was playing in a game where the rules weren't the same. His strength, his wealth, his influence, they all seemed irrelevant now. What truly mattered was something he hadn't even considered: mastery over oneself. Miguel's power wasn't about domination, it was about complete and utter control over his body, his mind, and the way he engaged with the world around him. Dylan felt a sense of defeat creeping in, not because he lacked strength, but because he lacked the same level of mastery. By the time the final round arrived, it was clear who the true victor was. Miguel stood tall, his composure unshaken, while Dylan could barely summon the energy to keep going. He had given everything he had, and yet it was clear that Miguel was on a different level. With each test, each challenge, Miguel had shown him what true strength was: mental, emotional, and physical. Dylan realized with a sinking feeling that the game had changed long ago. This wasn't about who could lift the most or run the furthest. It was about who could endure the most, who could withstand the pressure and stay true to themselves through it all. And in that, Miguel had won, without question. As the final challenge came to a close, the crowd erupted in applause, but Dylan barely heard it. He stood there, breathless, defeated. For the first time in a long while, he felt small. The realization hit him hard. His strength, his wealth, his power had never been the true measure of who he was. In his desperate need to prove himself, he had overlooked the very thing that Miguel had understood all along. True strength didn't come from overpowering others. It came from within, from a place of calm and clarity. And in that moment, Dylan knew he had lost more than just a competition. He had lost his sense of self. After the final competition, the crowd's cheers slowly faded into the background as Miguel stood victorious, his calm demeanor unchanged. Dylan, still panting from the exertion, couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He had fought so hard, pushed his body and mind to the brink, yet he had been defeated by Miguel's quiet strength. As the crowd dispersed, Miguel approached Dylan with a soft smile, his eyes steady. Dylan expected some form of gloating, a moment where Miguel would rub his victory in his face. Instead, Miguel's words hit Dylan like a cold wave. "I never wanted your car, Dylan," he said, his voice steady. Dylan blinked, confused. "What do you mean? You could have had everything you wanted." Dylan stammered, his mind still reeling from the competition. Miguel shook his head slightly, as though the idea was something far beneath him. The car, the wealth, the recognition, it means nothing to me. It was never about that. It was about showing everyone that true strength comes from within. It's about humility, persistence, and resilience, not what we can buy or show off. The words were simple, but they struck deep, settling into Dylan's heart like a weight he couldn't lift. Dylan's mind raced, trying to grasp the depth of Miguel's revelation. He had been so fixated on the material, on the car, on the idea of winning for the sake of status, that he hadn't understood the deeper meaning behind Miguel's actions. Miguel had never cared about the external rewards. He had only wanted to demonstrate something much more profound. The true measure of strength wasn't in the things you owned or the power you held over others. It was in your ability to remain humble, to push forward when it seemed impossible, and to find inner peace despite the chaos around you. As the last of the guests left, Dylan stood alone in the quiet of the venue. The night had been a turning point for him, a revelation that would forever change the way he viewed success, strength, and happiness. He had spent so long chasing external validation, never realizing that the true measure of success was how you faced life's challenges, how you carried yourself through adversity. And Miguel had shown him that. Dylan was left standing in the silence, the weight of his own transformation settling in. This was only the beginning. After the competition, Dylan, humbled by his defeat, offers Miguel a business partnership, believing it to be a valuable gesture. However, Miguel, true to his philosophy, declines the offer. He explains that he has already found what truly matters: inner strength, peace, and self-realization. He doesn't need material wealth or external recognition to feel successful. Miguel reveals that his journey has led him to discover that true success lies not in what one owns or achieves, but in the authenticity of one's path and the wisdom gained through personal growth. Dylan, now understanding Miguel's message, begins to reflect on his own life and the emptiness of his pursuits. He realizes that the true measure of success is not in external markers, but in the inner peace and strength cultivated through humility and resilience. As Miguel walks away, Dylan watches him, now deeply aware of the wealth of character Miguel possesses. The story concludes with the realization that true power and success are found within, through the journey of self-discovery and authenticity.